Would you like to see some more professional conduct and ethical dilemmas that solicitors face on a daily basis that get assessed on the SQE? If so, you're in the right place. Stay tuned for the next episode of SQE TV.
If you wanna be solicitors, why don't you come and visit us at SQE TV?
In our first two videos in this mini-series on ethics and professional conduct, we've introduced you to the 7 SRA Principles and shown how you can map individual parts of the code to at least one of the principles. And in relation to each of them, we've given you some scenarios to help you start to analyse how you would apply them to particular fact patterns. So when the time comes in the exam or in practice, you're in a position to do the right thing. So we focused on principles 1, 2, 3 and 4 so far. So in this third and final video in the series, we're going to be looking at principles 5, 6 and 7.
SQE TV.
So let's talk about principle 5, which says you act with integrity. And you'll immediately appreciate that this principle overlaps with the one where you are required to uphold the rule of law and to act honestly. But there are many situations where you won't be in breach of the law and you won't be acting dishonestly, but you could be not acting with integrity. In other words, not upholding high moral standards. Sharp practice might be an example of that, or not saying something when you really ought to. In that sort of situation, you will be possibly not acting with integrity. A number of other situations will apply as well. And we can map one of the parts of the Code of Conduct to this particular principle. CCS 1.3 says you perform all undertakings given by you and do so within an agreed timescale. Now, just to remind you, an undertaking is a professional promise given by a solicitor or somebody who works within a firm of solicitors in the context of professional instructions to somebody who reasonably relies upon it. And in that sort of situation, it's really important that you not only comply with your undertaking, but you do so within the agreed timescale, or if there isn't one specified, that you do so within a reasonable time. And we've got an example from practice here. So you exchange contracts late on a Friday afternoon pursuant to Law Society Formula B, but unfortunately the last post or DX has been collected. So what's the ethical dilemma here? Well, the problem you've got is that you've given an undertaking because you've exchanged pursuant to Formula B without any variations, and that's the critical thing. In that situation, you've promised to send out the contract that day, and you can't do that now because the last document exchange, the last post has gone. So unless you can rush across town and deliver it by hand, or maybe put it on a courier, which may not be practical, then you are in difficulties. So what should you do in this scenario? Well, obviously call up the solicitor on the other side and say, listen, I should have varied Formula B when we spoke and said I can't get the contract out to you today, but I'll be getting it out to you tomorrow. Is that okay? And hopefully they'll say yes. But it's really important that you don't just cross your fingers and hope for the best, or just send it out tomorrow and hope that they don't notice. The really important thing is, as soon as you appreciate you can't honour an undertaking, is acting with integrity if you call up the solicitor on the other side and explain the problem and hopefully negotiate a resolution.
SQE TV.
So let's now go on and have a look at SRA Principle 6, which reads you act in a way that encourages equality, diversity and inclusion. And we can map to SRA Principle 6, CCS 1.1 from the Code of Conduct for Solicitors. And that reads, you do not unfairly discriminate by allowing your personal views to affect your professional relationships and the way in which you provide your services. Of course, if you did allow that to happen, you wouldn't be behaving in a way that was encouraging equality, diversity and inclusion, would you? So let's put this all into the context of a practical scenario that you might come up with in a SQE question. And it's this: a client instructs you to draft a will. The client holds strong but lawful views on a number of social issues, which are completely the opposite to your own values. In his will, the client is proposing to leave a gift to a lawful organisation which promotes the same views as your client, which again are not consistent with your values. So what's the ethical dilemma here? Well, you'd rather not be involved in drafting this will for the client or doing any work for this client, come to think of it. But what they're asking you to do is not unlawful, and you're not supposed to allow your personal views to interfere with your professional relationship. Otherwise, you're in breach of CCS 1.1. And by saying I don't want to do this, you're not behaving in a way that encourages equality, diversity and inclusion. So the vast majority of occasions, you're simply going to have to go ahead with this work and do it. In really exceptional cases, you might want to have a conversation with your supervisor, but I would say in the vast majority of those situations, the supervisor would simply turn around to you and say, you've got to comply with Principle 6 and CCS 1.1 and do the work. After all, you're a professional, you've been asked to do something lawful, which is to draft a clause in a will, get on with it. In which case, that's what you should do.
SQE TV.
And finally, let's have a look at SRA Principle 7, which says you act in the best interests of each client. And we can map an awful lot of the Code of Conduct for Solicitors to Principle 7 for obvious reasons, but the one we've chosen today is CCX 6.4, which says where you are acting for a client on a matter, you make the client aware of all information material to the matter of which you have knowledge. There are some exceptions to that, but we won't be dealing with that during the course of this particular discussion. Now, to put this all into context, let's give you a scenario. You hold information for a former client, which would now be of significant use to one of your other clients on an unrelated matter. So what's the ethical issue? Well, you've got a duty to act in the best interests of not just your former client, for whom you hold confidential information, but you've also got a duty to disclose all material information to your existing client. And therefore, you've got a conflict of these two duties. How can you keep the information confidential from the first client whilst also disclosing it to your current client to comply with Principle 7 and CCS 6.4. You can't square that circle unless you get the consent, and this is where we go into the exceptions, of the old client to disclose that information. But in almost all circumstances, you wouldn't expect the old client to give you that consent. So what should you do in that scenario? Well, if you can't comply with the code, whether it's the principle or CCS 6.4, you should personally cease acting, because if somebody else in the firm who doesn't have that information was to continue, they wouldn't be in breach of the code and the principle. But if you were to continue to act without the consent of the person whose confidential information it is, you wouldn't be able to comply with your duties under the code.
SQE TV.
Well done for getting to the end of this video, which of course was the third in a series of 3 that were devoted to ethical and professional conduct issues and how they may be assessed on the SQE. For the first 2 videos, if you've not checked them out, and I suggest you do, we followed a very similar format whereby we mapped parts of the Code of Conduct for Solicitors to individual principles and then looked at those in the context of exam-style scenarios. So let me leave you with a non-exclusive list of some of the major professional conduct topics. That's the duties of confidentiality, the duty of disclosure, conflicts of interest, undertakings and duties to the court that you as a solicitor will hold. I've listed these for you because you need to be really solid on those areas. Yes, there are many other professional conduct issues, but these are the sorts of things that can be regularly examined. So hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do like and subscribe. We love it when you do. Please do tap that notification bell. It really helps us beat that pesky algorithm that YouTube set for us. And as we always do, when we finish a YouTube video, we say, it's time for the jingle.
If you wanna be solicitors, why don't you come and visit us at SQE TV? SQE